Point two we have is volatile. Europe catches new election fever.
Right.
So what's going on there?
From disaster to existential angst, which could lead to disaster also. Why not laugh in the face of catastrophe, potential if not real? So let's shift seriously from the Middle East, where one could discuss endlessly and problems have not been solved ever. But things are slowly continuing their descent into worse there, to talk about Europe. And Europe, I think, is fundamentally going to be a sociological tale, but there certainly is current fever to discuss. And why don't you fill us in on how Europe seems to be sliding to the right?
So there were elections in the EU. They caused an earthquake. And what happened? Well, far-right parties won 25% of the 720 seats in the European Parliament. In the last elections, they won 20%. So it's not such a huge jump, but it is an earthquake because they did particularly well in Germany, which has long been the land of Putz Nazi guilt. And in Germany, the far-right Alternative for Germany, AfD, came second with 15.9% of the vote. The Conservative Christian Democratic Union won with 30% of the vote, but the ruling Social Democratic Party was annihilated pretty much. They just won 13.9% of the vote. Importantly, the AfD didn't just win seats in former East Germany, but they also increased their vote share from the under 24-year-olds. That went up from 5% to 16%. Now, that is a good litmus test, or maybe a leading indicator. Now, the real earthquake, however, is France. In France, Rassemblement National, RN, won 32% of the vote. And this is more than double the vote share of the French President Emmanuel Macron's centrist alliance.
A bit of color, Atul. What is the Rassemblement National? That's the current name for what used to be called the National Front, the Front National.
Exactly.
Which is it's a
Jean-Marie Le Pen
neo-fascist party. The leader of which, who was the father of the current leader, Marine Le Pen, was a French commando. Fought quite honorably in Algeria and so on. Well, maybe dishonorably, since he was engaged in torture, but who made his living by selling Nazi memorabilia and recordings of Nazi songs, and who denied the Holocaust, who said, but actually, if it happened, it was a minor detail because they were only Jews anyway. Things like that. And that's the foundation of the party that has now put a veneer of respectability on itself through a charismatic series of leaders. Marine Le Pen is very impressive. And that is what the essence of the party is. And we'll get to the why in a moment. But it's not just a conservative party.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because in the UK, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called a snap election. And then, of course, Emmanuel Macron has called another snap election just before the Paris Olympics to break the fever, far-right fever. And what's his calculation? His calculation is, well, if people actually have to vote for RN, they may not vote, and if they do vote for RN, it may be found out in power. People may weigh, measure, and find them wanting. Of course, Jordan Bardella is now the 28-year-old. Another good-looking chap. It seems you have to be good-looking in French politics. Another good-looking chap now challenging Macron, and there is a real chance that what Macron wants, and he said France needs a clear majority if it is to act in serenity and harmony. And it may well be that Mr. Good-Looking, who's echoing Xi Jinping in his appeal to harmony, may not have a parliament with any majority, because RN may be the largest party, probably most likely will be the largest party, but it may not have a majority. So you could have a messy coalition, you could have instability, you could have cohabitation. So there's complete chaos, and French markets have tumbled. Bondholders are worried because RN's economic policies are vague and they promise a lot of spending. In fact, their economics is quite left leaning, which is often the case with far right parties. And consumer sentiment is down too. So, why is all this happening? Over to you, Glenn.
Of course, the what's much easier, so I object. Why? I had one of the most enriching, personally, or challenging experiences I had, or assignments I had in my career, was very early on. Some of you might know I lived in France a number of times for my education, for work, and so on. And as a
We thought
junior
you were there for the
officer,
pretty French girls.
as a junior officer, I was assigned the task of following developments in the far right movements of Europe. And in part, as I was given that as a junior officer, because 40 years ago, it was considered a backwater, insignificant issue. The main issue was the Cold War clash between communism and liberalism, and the Communist Party of France at that time was getting 25% of the vote, and the far right parties were getting 7 or something at most. So they gave it to a junior officer, but I focused for years on the far right, and a decade even before that, I had what was a truly revelatory experience, which recurred, but one will suffice to make my point. I I lived in Grenoble, France, not the capital, and late at night, the cities outside of Paris in France, in the evenings they shut down. It's much quieter. At least then that was the case, and there would be few people on the streets. The only other people on the street, other than this 20-year-old college student who was wandering around, looking, marveling at medieval architecture, which is true. That's what I was sort of doing. I was living my romantic, pursuing my romantic muse. Um, were solitary Arab men who had no place to go, no families with them, were unwanted, and were literally wandering the streets or standing under arches or these forlorn figures. And they were the first or second wave of North African laborers that France needed to run its factories. But they were otherwise unwanted, and they were not ever integrated. So the occasional disaffected and alienated immigrant doesn't pose any particular problem. He's just a poignant figure. But when that becomes 18% of the population, you then have a sociological problem. Uh, Irrespective of whether you have a clash of religious traditions, which is the most fundamental and murderous of distinctions in human nature, human societies. And you do
Just
have that.
if I can add to your point, in Europe, the religious wars were particularly catastrophic. Catastrophic. They caused violence that Europe has probably never seen. Just even the world wars were not so destructive. And even in Paris, the Huguenots were massacred in 1572, and they were just Protestants. They were both Christian, Catholics, and Protestants. And
Well,
in
one
Germany,
third
the
of
30
the
Years' War.
population of Europe died in the
Yeah.
religious wars. One third of the entire continent. So it was quite clear to me as a youth that France and Europe was creating for itself a sociological problem, and I really did foresee it didn't take any particular insight. I think this was a time bomb. And so, what's happening in the United States, in England, in France, in Germany, in Holland, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, is fundamentally a reaction against, as we hear from the Republicans here, against uncontrolled immigration of the other people who are different, who threaten the fact that I like hot dogs and somebody else likes falafel or something to that effect. It's as superficial as that. but it has a core, and that is really the why. For the 40 years that I've actually going on 50 years that I've had been following the movements of the right in Europe, and America is still a European country fundamentally, uh, have risen, and we have come to the point where we do have a couple of neo, well, far right leaders in Europe, but they all are based upon whatever they say, an anti-immigration movement, so that people who look like me, who are Europeans, uh, have become fearful and are desperate to say no.
So they certainly may have immigration as their top issue, but immigration is an issue. The elites have failed to formulate proper immigration policies, and also there has been a politically correct culture that refuses to acknowledge problems with assimilation. So, yes, there is racism. Yes, immigrants do not assimilate, but there's also radicalization. There's also ghettoization. There's also the fact that a lot of my friends feel threatened when they go to certain areas in Frankfurt, which is the commercial capital of Europe. And there may not be a clash of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington put it, but there is certainly a clash of cultures. And the challenge of the assimilation of Muslim communities in Europe, which have high unemployment, which already France is very high unemployment. France has had over 10% unemployment since Francois Mitterrand. And the immigrant communities have even higher unemployment. And there are massive problems. This is happening obviously at a time when European demography is cratered. So you have a genuine angst because in a democracy, demography is destiny. And with the rise in immigrant populations, there's real fear that the European way of life stands threatened. So there's a very real fault line, and European elites, since the last few decades, have relied more on spin and less on addressing real problems. You could say
Well,
that is
there are
particularly
a couple of
true of,
lessons that the
yeah,
Europeans can only learn through experience. I'm not being in any way patronizing, but America, as we all know, it's a trite thing to say, but it is true, is a nation of immigrants. And there are two sociological realities, you can term it how you want, that America has had to struggle with, but that helped define American culture over now 4 centuries. And that is that so long as a new population, an immigrant population, in America's case, former slave blacks migrating to northern cities after the American Civil War 175 years ago, or a massive flow of immigrants from Europe who were not Anglo-Saxons in the second half of the 19th century and the first 20 years of the 20th. When those flows reach 10% of the native dominant culture and population, uh, up to then they're viewed as exotic and there's no problem and they're good laborers and whatever. After that, they are viewed as disruptive, a threat, and are rejected. When you add in questions of race and religion, the circumstances become dramatically more explosive. That just happens in societies. I've mentioned this before. I think the complacent and patronizing cultures of Boston and Chicago, for example, looking down upon the race of the South, were high and mighty in their attitudes until the migration of blacks reached about 10% of the populations, at which point you started to have race riots in a significant degree, and not just the occasional bit of racism that was viewed as not consequential. The second thing is that it takes, and this is the American experience, is that it takes 3 generations at least for an immigrant and his or her offspring to almost fully integrate into the dominant society. So the first migrants will always remain Chinese or Indian or whatever they are in the United States or in France. They'll remain Moroccan and Muslim. The second generation, the children who were born there, are alienated. They don't belong, and this is a terribly poignant tale that we see frequently portrayed. They don't feel fully French or fully Maghrébin from North Africa or fully American or fully Indian. They are both. And then their children, largely in general, become fully integrated to, or almost fully integrated into the dominant society. That's a span of anything from 60 to 100 years that it takes in the best of circumstances. And when you add a large immigration someplace, that process can be slowed. So you see in Miami today, Miami has such a large Latin American population that immigration is not even necessary. They can lead fully successful lives. And Miami is, in some ways, the capital of South America, certainly financial capital. That's the dynamic Europe has never experienced, and which has defined America, and that leads to the rise of populism in the far right. And that's the what. Now the so what, and we have to be quick on it so we can pass to the next
So
subject.
just very quickly, though, before we get on, so what, there are two more things adding to the current European malaise. One, of course, is the economy isn't great. Far right parties tend to improve their popular standing when there are other crises. Then
Well,
people
what is a
flock to them.
Nazi? A national socialist.
Socialist, Democratic Workers' Party. But anyway, so inflation is up thanks to the Russia-Ukraine war. Cost of living crisis is hitting all European economies. There's unemployment. And of course, I mentioned this earlier. I was getting to the spin factor in politics. You've had the likes of David Cameron and Emmanuel Macron and others who are basically not the Charles de Gaulle's, not the Winston Churchill's, not even the Maggie Thatcher's and Francois Mitterrand's. They are basically people who weasel their way up the political machine. They are spin monkeys. You find a lack of leadership in the continent, and there is political sclerosis because of decline in political parties, the decline in discourse, and the extraordinary red tape and the thickening of processes. So desperate measures lead, desperate conditions lead people to turn to desperate solutions. So what, Glenn? Shoot.
Well, it certainly has an effect on all of these increasing tensions and the increasing likelihood, if not certainty, that far right parties will come to power in the major countries of Europe or throughout Europe. Um, and I think that's we've seen it happen already in Italy and in Hungary and in Poland. So I think this trend will continue.
In Italy, Giorgia Meloni has moved more to the center after getting to power. So
yes,
that's also a trend that once some of these far right parties come to power, they do not act in as extreme a manner as they do when they're in opposition. In Poland, you had a far right party in power. In Hungary, of course, Viktor Orban has suffered a setback in the European elections. They're still doing well. They still did fairly well in the European elections, and the drift has been more extreme. So there's a spectrum there too.
Yeah, I think Italy is perhaps so far the exception in how it's relatively moderated. The right has relatively moderated, far right. Anyway, it certainly is affecting all of this. These social, political pressures, trends are affecting consumer sentiment, markets, and bondholders. But I think more concretely, we can probably anticipate a continuation or strengthening of what already is a global trend for the past 20 years of the decline of the support for free trade and inclination to protectionism. We find this even in the United States, of course, with President Biden. Nationalism tends to equate to, I would argue, protectionism in policies as a whole. which also then implies that the multilateralism would decline in its appeal. And all of the far right parties in Europe are, to varying degrees, hostile to the bloodless socializing, destroying of essence of life, European Union. And for that matter, from the imperialist control of by the United States of Europe through NATO. So I think multilateralism will continue to slide into, if not disfavor, increasing challenge. And then the social democratic model, which is arguably the most successful political model in history. Um, I'll say a provocative thing, but I think that's easily defendable. Is progressively discredited now. The figures for the votes of the Social Democrats, however call themselves, continues to decline.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.